It's over on that seat over there. You will. All right, well, hello everyone. My name's Graeme Gellatly, and in English we have a couple of words to describe what happened to me yesterday. The polite one is omnishambles. So I lost everything. So this presentation is not the presentation I was going to give, but it's the presentation that you're going to get. So we're going to go along and we're going to see what we can do. So the talk's about utilising domain-driven design concepts within the OCA, and I suppose the first question to ask is kind of how did we get here, and what is this talk about? And so probably about a year ago, in actual fact, September last year, I was struggling. Productivity on my team was a bit low. We're doing all the right things. We're running Agile. Anybody here run Agile? No, right? Agile sucks, right? And you learn that the hard way, right? And the reason that Agile is difficult, and the reason that a lot of these things are difficult is that when we pass off requirements to our developers, is that we're typically asking to do a lot of the design work themselves within it. And so I was going, well, how do I get this back? How do I get domain knowledge into my team? How do I do these things? And surfing the internet, I discovered a blog article by a guy called Adam Dimitriuk on a way of designing information systems using event modeling. And just so you guys are aware, my classical training is information systems. I later became a chartered accountant and did a master's in business. So I'm not a developer, although I've had to learn to become one over the years. And this really sat down for me. It was talking about how we model information systems in a way that engages the greatest audience possible. And we'll go through an example soon. I've picked a module out of the OCA on how to do that. And of course, I started pulling on the strings and discovered that was based on another methodology called event storming by Alberto Brandolini. Has anybody heard of that? And then I kind of got pulled down the whole Martin Fowler, Eric Evans route of domain-driven design and found some really, really useful concepts in there. And so you kind of go, look, this is great, but I've got all this existing code and I've still got this problem that how do I get these concepts into my development teams and also into my, I know we like to use the word functional here, but my domain expert teams. And realistically, the idea that really started to take hold was baking some of these concepts into our code just through refactoring the existing code to make it more readable, better documented, and easier to understand by a wider audience. So really that's what this talk is about, and we're going to go through and we're going to talk about it. So first of all, we'll talk about event modeling. Now, when I presented event modeling to my team, they were within about 30 seconds, they're like, okay, Graeme, we got it, move on to the next thing. So it's a really, really simple way with which to map out things. So I'll just zoom this in a bit so that we can start to see across. So, wrong way. So really what we're talking about is that when we're talking to, come on, Control-Shift+++. When we're talking about our systems and when we're talking to our customers about what their requirements are, or in this case here, when we're using event modeling to effectively retrospectively design our systems and ask what they're about, is that we have some key concepts, right? So we've got a user interface where the user issues a command, an event takes place in the system, right? And those systems are something called bounded context, which I'll talk about in a minute. That will return a view to the client, which is the user interface, right? And then we have some given when then things to describe state. And so what we've done here is I selected this at random, this module out of the OCA. So this is a module out of Sale Workflow called Sale Manual Delivery. Sorry, I'm struggling to move my screens about here. Let's just use the hand tool and hope that it works. And so Sale Manual Delivery, if we look at it, is fundamentally it's a module that allows you to defer the procurement of the products to a future date. So you've got a sale that needs to go on for a long period of time, and you want to deliver products at different times across it. So that's what the module does. And this is the event module model that I quickly drew up on my brand new German installation of Kubuntu this morning to describe it. And so in this particular case, because I'm doing it retroactively, I've taken actual screenshots out of the module. If you're doing new stuff, typically you would just put up wireframes, right? And the idea is that we can communicate between development teams, domain teams, and end users in a very simple way, almost like telling a story. And so while this is the finished product, well, it's not quite the finished product because there's some stuff to go on there, is that there is a process that goes on and that we identify events. So if we start with the events, we create a sales team, or we update a sales team to say that this sales team has a manual delivery, right? And then at some point the sale is confirmed. If it's not a manual delivery sale, it will run the procurement engine. Now, a procurement engine, the way it's displayed there, is really just an automation. Now, of course, procurement engine's actually inside of Odoo, but in terms of the context that we're talking about, which is the ability to procure it, to us it's just a domain service. We don't really care what goes on in the procurement engine for our module, right? It just happens. And then later, we'll create a manual delivery, and all of this is happening in our sales bounded context or our sales subsystem. And when we're talking about this idea of bounded context, so a bounded context, what we're really saying is that within domain-driven design, one of the key concepts is ubiquitous language. So in a way, these bounded contexts really define where our language changes, right? So for example, if you work in the returns department, right, DOA means something very, very different to if you work in finance, right? And if you work in a hospital, it means something completely different entirely, right? So we have this ubiquitous language, and the idea is that through development, through design, through communication with our end users within that bounded context, is that we all use the same language and we understand the same meaning for those words. So an order line in the sales context means something different to an order line in the purchase context, for example. So if I'll just get rid of this library here because we don't need it. And so then finally we confirm our manual delivery, and at the end we get some pickings created out of our procurement engine. And so if we read across the blue lines like a timeline, everything that happens above the line is someone or something interacting with the system. So it might be a sales user, it might be a sales manager, it might be some kind of automation, it might be a third-party API, it could be a whole bunch of different things, right? And the reason that we apply the same rules in this event modeling concept to this is that if we take, for example, this order lines to procure non-manual, or even these, I've made a mistake there, but order lines to procure manual, is that we could do it. The idea is that these automations are really just taking over from a human, and that we're just providing a view to that automation, it's providing a command back, and it's updating the state within our system. Okay. So at a high level, that's what we're going to go through today, is that using this, I suppose, retrospectively created version of sale manual delivery, we're going to look at how that affects our code. Just before I do that, one of the really useful things about this model is that, of course, it just presents a bunch of stories and events across time. So we've got the user actions there in blue, create delivery, manual delivery created. Our events are always in the past tense because they're events, they've happened in the past. And then green is the view that we're returning back to the next thing. So it's very, very simple. And as I say, my guys got it in about 30 seconds and away they went. And what this does is it does two things for us if we define. One is it tells our developers the limits of what they're meant to be doing, yeah, and where their concerns lie. The second thing it does is that it communicates really well to end users, and particularly to people who've got to develop training, right? It becomes very easy to do training videos or trainings when you've just got to walk along a timeline of a story. All right, so let's just have a look at this code. As I say, this is not quite the way I intended to do this, but we will give it a go. And there's some other concepts that we'll work through as we go. So this is the sale manual delivery model. as I say, I honestly picked this at random. I did not know that Joel was the author, but we're going to pick it apart anyway. So one of the first concepts I really want to talk about, it kind of sits outside this, but when we're looking to refactor and change our code to do this, there's sort of three really deeply related concepts that matter, right? The first one is tell, don't ask. Yeah, so that there means that we see this a lot, both, not so much actually, Odoo's pretty good at this, but within the OCA we see this a lot, right? Is that we have a function, it gets some data, we ask it for some data, we do some stuff with that data, and then we do something back with it, right? That's asking, right? We ask, we do some stuff, we send it back. The second related concept, and this relates to maintainability, it relates to readability, and it relates to engaging your domain experts with your code and really helping reviewers, is this concept of coupling versus cohesion. And so coupling is really talking about, you know, how tight does one model or one module relate to, you know, so how tightly coupled is sale order line, to stock moves, to products, to all sorts of things. And then cohesion is something slightly different. So we don't want highly coupled code, because that's where our bugs come in, that's where things get hard to develop, that's where things get complex, right? We want our code to be loosely coupled. Cohesion's the opposite. So cohesion is how tightly bound is our code within a given model, so sale order line, for example. And so the idea being here is that if something changes within sale order line, right, I don't need to go looking in sale order, I don't need to go looking in stock moves, I don't need to go looking in procurement, I don't need to go looking in products, yeah, when I'm trying to do migrations and change code, because all the behavior that's relevant to my sale order line is contained within the class. So we'll give you a quick example here of something that is bad or non-domain driven. I might just zoom this up a bit. So it's okay if you don't know code, because we're going to make this really, really simple and show you that it's not that hard. That said, sometimes people ask me how I learned Odoo, given the fact that I didn't come from a development background at all. I printed out the source code and read it, and I think it's always very useful for domain experts to at least be able to read code and understand it. So what we're looking at here is a classic example of asking instead of being told. Yeah. You can imagine a reviewer looking at that particular line and going, looks right. But it also brings another concept in, which is this concept of vague intentions, right? You don't really know what that's doing or why it's doing it. So we can see here that we're looking at our order lines, we're then looking at the product, we're asking it some questions about the quantity to procure, and then we've got this move ID stuff. We don't really know why, and then we're going to set a field called has pending delivery. Now, if you've read a lot of code, right, are there any developers in the room? Right, you probably know what's going on there, right, and what's happening at a rough level, but it's not particularly clear, right? For a domain person, they have no idea. Right? And so this is the first thing that we should really, really try and get out of our code. So how might we rewrite this in order for it to be, first of all, tell, don't ask, second of all, more cohesive, and third of all, make its intent clear. And what we'll do is we'll just have a look at how we've adjusted that code. So there's a bunch of commits here. This here actually changes over time, but the key thing here is that instead of all of that code up there where we don't really know what's going on, we just say, ask the order line and it will tell me if the delivery is pending or not, right? So it becomes really, really simple. And what we do is we massively reduce our coupling, right? So all of a sudden, instead of sale order now being tied to the sale order line, it's quantity procure, it's being tied to stock moves, it's being tied to products. We don't care, right? If Odoo changes something to do with sale order lines or something has to happen in migration, it's all nicely and neatly kept within there, right? And so we've moved all that code down to there. Now this is the first run. We've taken it all through, but as you'll see as we go through, this will change a bit more. we'll just run through the next commit. Now this is on change considered harmful, right? Do not use on changes if you possibly can. And I'll tell you why, like, it's one of the best things that Fabian did, and he led that development, right, was getting rid of on changes for computed fields. Now, the reason for that is that we have this idea of, we want to have an imperative shell and a functional core, right? So we'll have some functions that are imperative, action do this, button do that, right? And then we want to effectively move all the business logic out of that into a functional core, such that our business logic is not dependent on whether we are accessing it from the web client, whether we're accessing it from shell, whether we're accessing it from some third-party system, and also whether we're writing to a database, whether we're writing to storage. And we've started to see some of this come into sort of the storage repos where really we're just plugging in persistence layers in different ways, right? So on change, the problem with on change is that it only works in the user interface, right? So we should always be using computes, and that's kind of a minor point, that we need to be really, really careful in our code that we're not tying ourselves to a particular user interface. There's a little bit more of an insidious example in this repo of where we've tied ourselves to a user interface. Constraints of validation errors, that there doesn't really matter. Okay. The other thing that's happened here in this code, so when I dug into it, has pending delivery was used in a single place, right? Its sole purpose is whether or not to show a button can create pending delivery, right? So we should be clear in our naming of things and make it clear to people. And that is really all there is to it, right? The other thing as well is that everybody uses this for rec and self pattern, yeah? What we really should be trying to do here is try and use the words that we'd use within our domain context. So instead of for rec and self, for sale and self. And the other thing that we've done here is that within the user interface, rather than have all that complex stuff, just say, look, just ask the sales order, can we create a manual delivery? If we can, show the button. Don't add all these other extra things and business logic into our UI if we can help it. Now, I want to get on to the big stuff, and is this the one? All right, so this is imperative shell functional core. So I'm just going to have a little look at how this module works, and it's going to explain why our event model was really, really important in the first place. So what we have here at sale order line, anybody who's familiar with Odoo from, I suppose, a sales stock perspective will know that when they confirm a sales order, we launch our procurement engine and it does it, right? And we got that from the rules. So we have a look here, and we see that down the bottom here, we've got our imperative action launch stock rule, the standard one that we use. And we see we filter out the lines and we send those. And then up here, we have a new method called action launch stock rule manual, which repeats what action launch stock rule does, but for manual delivery lines. This is a big problem, right? It's a big problem for two reasons. The first one is that if we talk about our original module design, what were we trying to do? Effectively, emulate the behavior of the sales order at a date in the future, all right? So therefore, we should be able to use the same function, right? We don't want to start inventing things. The second problem that this creates is that you create hidden bugs and hidden dependencies within your code. So what happens if we have another module that overrides action launch stock rule? All of a sudden that doesn't work. So we've got to be really, really careful about this. And so if we have a look at where we end up with, right? So the other problem with this, is that it's an imperative shell, obviously, but it's got the business logic contained within it, right? And so we don't want to do that. We want to we want the imperative, the action launch stock rule to run, but we just want to take the view of what we want it to run. So how do we do that? I might do it on this one here, just with the completed one. So the sale order line. Action launch stock rule manual just goes. Yeah, we don't need it, right? We've looked back at our event model and we've said it's just doing the same thing as a sale order does at confirmation. We don't need a second function in order to do this, right? All we're going to do is say, if these conditions are met, launch, and away we go. And that all works. There is a little bit of stuff we need to do in order to make things work, but fundamentally that's it, right? Much cleaner, much easier to read, you know, I don't know, 30 or 40 lines gone. And we also see this again over here, where, by the way, I honestly picked this at random, right? So if we have a look here, we've got this search picking for assignation. And this should be a red flag as well, right? Because original domain used in super, well, why don't you just get the domain from super in the first place, right? Why do we need to repeat all of this in order to add this in? The other thing as well is that search is an imperative word. So this is, again, we're putting our business logic into a function which is imperative. So we should really just say, let's just pull this out and do it that way. And so how does this look if we do it with a imperative shell? And by the way, a big part of this is to make your code easier to read so that domain experts can understand it, right? So we replace search picking for assignation with an override of search picking for assignation domain, and we just add our fields that we need to do to it. That's all there is to it. And so all of a sudden, all of our supers still work, all of our code still works, and we avoid some pretty nasty bugs in there. So we'll just cover off one final point because we're running out of time, and then I'll just let it go to questions so that we can talk through it, yeah? And it is a little bit of, I'll just pull it off here. And that is in our wizard. So within our wizard, we've got a default get. That's all great. We'll talk about that possibly in a minute. Domains, particularly domains here. So there's two things, right? And this is a little bit harder to spot, and it's something we're really, really aware of, is that is a user interface constraint. Yeah, and so again, we're binding our business logic to the interface that the user uses to access the system. So we can't really fix that. That's the way that Odoo works. Right? There are some things that we can do. But the second problem here, and it comes back to this bounded context, what was the job of our module in the first place? Yeah? It was to emulate the sales order, right? And defer the procurement. Now all of a sudden we're making decisions within development about what should be a valid domain here for a shipping address when we should just be asking that from the sales order. And so while I can't solve the first problem, the second problem is a little bit easier to solve, right? And that all we do is we just say, and we should be doing this a lot. It's not going to load. So all we do is we say, forget the domain, just look it up from the sale order line and use that domain, right? Now all of a sudden, it's that the code works as expected, right? The user's not able to select one shipping address on a sales order, but not able to select it on a deferred order or vice versa. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap it up there. There's plenty more that we could go through around helpers, value objects, service domains, and these sorts of things. But I really just wanted to give this talk today to serve as an introduction that, look, there is a different way. It's certainly, you know, our bug solving time since we've been implementing this within my organization has dropped from, well, the latest numbers is our average bug solved in about 19 minutes. And that's from reporting, right? Because once you've got a real simple way of defining, this is what my is, you know, I've got my command, change my subsystem, update my view, got a nice easy slice, when you've got bugs, you know exactly where they are, right? It takes seconds. So I've probably got time for about 1, maybe 2 questions. So if anyone's got a question, I won't be running the mic around for this one.
Well, did you honestly pick this one just at random? Because it's such an evocative example.
So honestly, you'll find this throughout the OCA. So truth be told, the first module I picked was agreement rebate, because I hate that module for a lot of reasons. Yes. Yeah, right?
I'm in full agreement.
Right, and so and it's because of bounded context things, right? Is that agreement rebate confuses itself with being an agreement or with being, you know, which fundamentally everything's an agreement, right? A sales order's agreement, purchase order, right? And so that's what I was originally going to do this on, and then I realized I only had 30 minutes. Right, and so I went, well, what can I do? So I literally went to the repo, looked down, thought, that's an interesting module, I haven't heard of that before, let's run with that. It's nice and short, nice and simple to explain. And then as we got through it, there was quite a lot to talk about in there. I was really surprised. All right, one last question, then we can all have lunch. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I will just finish on one thing that's not in here. And there's this concept of value objects within domain-driven design, because that's where things get interesting. And I think as a community, there are some certain things that we can do around it. So a value, effectively, right, you've got fields.char, right? Now, fields.char will hold email addresses, it will hold URLs, it will hold a whole bunch of different things, yeah, right? And then within our code, we'll be saying, is this a valid email address, right? We're calling all these helpers to check and utils. Whenever you see helper classes, that's kind of telling you that something's not quite right from a domain design perspective, right? So in the future, I'd love to see things like fields.email, yeah? And fields.email has got all the built-in check-in and everything that we need to do to make sure it's valid. We don't need to remember to check in every part of the code. We don't need to do a whole bunch of things, right? And so this idea of value objects for the future is something that I'm really, really keen to explore. Otherwise, thank you everybody for your time. I hope you found this valuable, and I hope we all have a good lunch as well. And by the way, the code for this, if anyone wants to see the process, how it changed, everything else, is up on my personal repo on GitHub under sale workflow.